So we did now learn how to send GET requests and how to fetch data and how to show a loading and error state if needed. Now let's take the next step and let's also send data to the backend, not just fetch data from there. And for that, I want to make sure that if I click one of these places, a request is sent to the backend and this place data or some place identifier is sent to the backend so that there in my backend, it's stored in this user places JSON file, which in the end represents a database table that stores the data of the favorite places a user selected. For that, in my backend code, I got this put route here, this put/user-places route. This route wants a put request, not get, not post, but put. And then it expects to get the place ID of the place that should be stored for the user in the request body. Because when sending non-get requests, you often have request bodies attached to those outgoing requests, which carry data that should be submitted to the backend. Therefore, here in the available places component, in the template, I have the app places component, and that component emits the select place event whenever the user clicks on one of these places. So in the available places component, we can listen to this select place event on app places and then trigger some function on select place, for example, when that event occurs. It's also worth noting that this event carries the place object as data. So we can use the $event variable here, which is automatically generated and managed by Angular, to pass that emitted place data onto this method. We have to, however, add that method now as a first step to the available places component class. And I'll do that here after ng-on-init, let's say. And I expect to get the selected place, which will be of type place, as a parameter here. Well, and now with that, we can and should, of course, send such a put request. So again, we can use the HTTP client and then the put method to send such a request and send that to HTTP localhost 3000/user-places. That is the route that's exposed by that backend. Now, put then also needs a second argument, which is the data that should be attached to that request. Now, you could attach an empty object if you have no real data you want to send, but in this case here, this route expects a request body that contains a place ID. So, in the Angular code, you should add a place ID key to that object. And the data you send here, by the way, doesn't have to be an object. It could also be an array. But here we need an object. And that object should have a place ID property. And Angular will automatically convert this object to JSON data using the JSON data format to attach it to the outgoing request and send it to the backend. Now, of course, we need to define the value for that place ID property here, and that should be selected place.id. So the ID of the selected place on which the user clicked, that's set as a value for this place ID property in this object that is attached as JSON data to this outgoing put request. That's what's happening here. Now, if you would save it like this, nothing would happen if you click on a place though. If you do that and you take a look at your network tab here in the DevTools, you won't see any new request here. And the reason for that is that just as with GET requests, you need to subscribe to a request to trigger it. So even though it's a put request and we might not necessarily be interested in the response, though we also might be interested, but let's say we're not. Even then, you have to subscribe to trigger that request. Now, just as before, you can, of course, add your observer object to be notified once the request is complete, if there is an error, or about the next value that's emitted, which would be the response. Because even though if you're not interested in the response, or maybe even if there wouldn't be a meaningful response or no meaningful data sent back, even in those cases, you would still get one. And you could still output that response data if there was any, like this. So that is always an option. But with that, this request will now be sent whenever this method is triggered. Therefore, if you save that and reload, and you wait for those places to arrive, if you clear the network tab so that we see a new request instantly, if you click on a place, you see there is a new request sent here. This request, you can see that the payload of it is this object with a place ID key, which contains the place ID. And you can see the response that's sent back, which would be an object with the updated user places. In addition, if you go to the backend code, you can see that in the user places JSON file, it's no longer an empty array, but instead this place object has been added there. And that all proves that sending this request worked. And that's how easy it is to send data to the backend. And of course you could and typically should now still also handle loading states in case handling that submitted data takes a bit longer on the backend, and also handle potential errors. And we will do this later. Before we do that though, I want to make sure that we also see those user places here in this favorite places box. And that'll be the next step. So now that we're able to pick places we like, I want to make sure that we can also load them here and show them here in this favorite places box. So this box, and therefore in the end the user places component, should be populated with places that are stored in this user places JSON file. Again, for that we have an endpoint which we can use. You can send GET requests to user-places to get back those places that are marked as favorites. And therefore, we can essentially copy a lot of the code we have here in available places and copy this entire ng-on-init method there and copy that into the user places component TypeScript file. We'll have to adjust it, but it's a start. Now, we don't just want to copy that. Instead, I will also copy my places signal is fetching and the error signal. And I'll also make sure that these injected values are available, HTTP client and destroy ref. So I'll copy that as well, all here into user places component. And for completeness sake, implement the on-init interface. And then make sure that we import all the things we're using. So signal, inject the place model, import it from that place model file, and also HTTP client and destroy ref. And of course, also those operators we're using, map and catch error. And also, of course, throw error. So all these things should be imported into this file. And we also need to adjust this URL and send the request to user-places. And maybe then also update the error message. Something went wrong, fetching your favorite places could be the error message. But that should then be almost all. With that, we can then also grab the code from the available places template and bring that over into the user places template. and replace this to-do text with it. Though here I don't want to listen to the select place function since we already marked a place as a favorite here. We can later make sure that we can click on it again to remove it, but for the moment I'll just leave it like this. And I'll say fetching favorite places here. Now, since we have a lot of code duplication, we could also think about using some shared component here to outsource shared logic, but I'll not do that here. Instead, I'll soon use a service for sharing some logic. But for the moment, let's just copy it. And if you copied all that code and you reload the application, you should see the favorite places down there. And there I don't have some arbitrary delay, so they appear pretty much instantly. If I add a second place and maybe a third place, and I then reload, you'll see that those places are added here as well. What you'll also see is that they're not added right away. If I select a place, it doesn't show up down here unless I reload. So that's something we'll fix later. But for the moment, we can see that fetching those places worked, and in the end, of course, hopefully unsurprisingly, it's the same approach as before. But now, since we have a decent amount of code duplication here, besides maybe trying to use some shared component, we could look into using some service to outsource at least some shared logic.